Good morning, everyone. It is Monday, March the 2nd, and welcome to 7Investing Live. This is our live stream event we host every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 10 o'clock Eastern Time to showcase and spotlight several of the stock market's most compelling and intriguing opportunities. My name is Simon Erickson. I'm the founder and CEO of 7Investing. You can see all of our stock market recommendations, all of our long-term actual stock picks at 7investing.com. If you're interested in getting started and seeing those actual recommendations and also our monthly best buys, check out 7investing.com/subscribe, where your first 7 days are entirely risk-free and entirely at zero upfront cost. Our show has been off to a fantastic start. We're now in the third month of our 7Investing Live. A huge thank you and a shout out to our producer, Heather Horton, for making the show as much of a success as it has been. And I think it's a good time to recap what just happened in February, because I would describe February as one of the most insight-dense months we've had of live stream events. And perhaps it's a good time to go back and recap a lot of what we've talked about and a lot of what's going on, because I don't want this to slip through the cracks. I don't want us to just forget about this. I want to double click on the semiconductor industry right now, because this is one of the most red hot sectors of the market. We know the S&P 500 has been having, for the most part, a pretty good year, other than the SaaS apocalypse that we've been going through these last few weeks or so. NVIDIA and AMD and all the chip stocks have been soaring to new highs. And it seems like they're not slowing down, right? Even the tech companies that benefit from the innovation that's going on in the semiconductor industry continue to do very well. And I think it was a great time in February to reassess and reevaluate, where do we stand, and is there further upside for a lot of these stocks? And so, in addition to me sharing my own thoughts, my own insights, we reached out to several guests to talk specifically about a bunch of different sectors, subsectors, maybe we'll call them, within the semiconductor larger market. And I'm going to recap a lot of those here in the first part of the call. I will take a breath and a moment to catch my breath and to have some coffee between them. Heather, I'll bring you in for some comments on those as well. And then at the very end of the show, as we wrap this up at the end of the half hour here, I'm going to actually share my recommendation. I'm not going to share the actual name of the recommendation. I'm going to describe the recommendation that I made as my official 7Investing pick for March, which is in the semiconductor industry and is kind of the result of everything we've been learning all month. This is why I ultimately chose this stock out of all the options that were available for the official recommendation in 7Investing for March, which we just published yesterday morning on March the 1st. So with that in mind, Heather, let's jump into it. Let's go to the first of our shows that we had in February. This was back on, it was technically on January the 31st, but it was published, I believe, on February the 1st. This was the one that we had on The Eyes of AI was the name of this one. And this was our special guest, Emmet Savage, who came from My Wall Street. We discussed how there's a new use of physical AI in a bunch of applications that are out there. What does that mean? Well, AI is not just a command prompt that we're typing things into, interacting on computer screens. It is actually aware of its surroundings right now. There we go. Perfect. The eyes of AI. Here we go. With Emmet, and one of the things that Emmet was describing there is behind, the self-driving cars that are out on the roads, you've got LiDAR for the most part. That's the cars making sense of their surroundings and doing the right actions. So they know that they're stopping at stop signs, or they're not supposed to put the brakes on when they see somebody crossing right in front of them on the road. But there's a new technology that is called solid state LiDAR with zero moving parts, much more dependable, and also costs that are getting down to be mass market affordable. And so we're seeing modern vehicles, modern self-driving vehicles, and then also contextually aware robots that are being equipped with solid state LiDAR as digital sensors to help them navigate the world around them. And not only navigate, like we've got iRobot, the Roombas that are moving around our floors and cleaning them up as vacuum cleaners, but also interacting. Self-driving cars is one example. Industrial sensors are now being equipped onto robots that are actually doing in hazardous environments or in deep sea environments. They're doing some really cool things for industrial purposes, especially in the energy industry. And then one of the other really neat ones I thought was smart infrastructure. This is something that's already caught on in Asia Pacific, specifically in China, where not only vehicles but buildings are being equipped with sensors that can actually detect crowd mentality. Police forces are using this to detect mobs that might be forming in certain areas, and so they can deploy people to go control those things, to look for fugitive that are on the lam, things like this, smart infrastructure for security and crowd analytics and logistics. I thought that was kind of a neat thing, because these projects are not, you're equipping a sensor for a device here or there that you're selling to consumers. This is something for smart cities that are massive, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure build-outs. And you're starting to see them again in Asia Pacific a lot. You're also starting to see them in France, in airports. The SFO airport in San Francisco has now got digital twins and infrastructure that's equipped for stuff like this. We can see those proprietary AI solutions with solid state LiDAR to make sense of a lot of the surroundings. I thought that was a really neat application. And the stock that we talked about, that Em and I talked about for this first show in February, was a company called Ouster. Ticker on that was OUST. The NASDAQ is where the exchange that is traded. And of course, this is a leader in solid state digital LiDAR systems. They're becoming quite popular. As we understand it, they are supply constrained and sold out with a lot of their product lines right now. This is a smaller company that's got a neat technology that's growing like gangbusters right now, and is really kind of empowering physical AI and a lot of the new infrastructure build out that's going on. So Heather, I'm going to take a 5-minute break. There's the overview of physical AI. That first show, again, that we published, I believe, right at the beginning of February, was called The Eyes of AI with Emmet Savage. Any thoughts or insights about that show? It was really a kind of a fun one that you and I filmed with him.
That was a great show. Yeah, my two top takeaways from that was the solid state LiDAR was really interesting from Ouster, because the solid state LiDAR lasted longer, was actually cheaper to produce. And so it was just a win-win for companies in that were trying to install it places, because it would, last longer, just more cost efficient in all ways. The second really cool thing about LiDAR over just traditional cameras for AI's eyes was that there was the security concern of just putting cameras all over cities. People don't love that. But LiDAR allows AI to see what's going on. But as he talked about, it was the geometry of shapes. It knows that there's people there. It doesn't know what people are there. And so it's a way for privacy to be maintained while still letting cities develop into a smarter AI future. And those are
It's
my two top, that was a really cool stock. I'm definitely looking at that one for my portfolio.
That's a good point too. The interaction of security and the need of keeping people safe, but also respecting privacy, especially when you're in a city, you want to be walking around and make sure your privacy is protected. Good points on that one. Again, Ouster OUST was the ticker of that first one that we published at the very beginning of February. We then moved on a week later, and we had another show called The Future of the Chip Industry with Robert Quinn. Also, we kind of called it the future of semiconductor manufacturing was the other name that we gave to this one, because it kind of focused on, you've got all these cool chip designers, the NVIDIAs of the world, the AMDs of the world, but then you've kind of got a bottleneck on the manufacturing of them, right? In fact, Taiwan Semiconductor is producing more than 80% of the most cutting edge semiconductor chips that are manufactured in the entire world. And of course, we know there's geopolitical risks between China and Taiwan. Now we know that Taiwan Semi is moving a lot of its manufacturing to the United States to get away from a lot of those political risks. But there's kind of been some discussions of how can we even keep up with the massive amount of manufacturing need for these cutting edge chips that are powering AI out there. And then how are we going to do it? Can we be creative in the design of these chips? Because Moore's law is really getting more and more difficult. Robert is an expert in this space. He actually, was a guy that would roll up his sleeves and do a lot of the installation of the equipment that was going into fabs, right? He was the guy that was doing that a couple of decades ago. And he's doing more of media and consulting. And, he's calling himself a semiconductor ambassador these days. But Robert really knows his stuff, and he's seen the bottlenecks. He described memory as one of the biggest bottlenecks in the AI industry right now. DRAM memory and then high bandwidth memory that's produced by Micron is sold out for the entire year already under long-term supply contracts with large customers that are deploying memory in their data centers out there. And so the idea was, can you actually make a data center at a lower cost and faster than you're able to do it today? And so who else other than Elon Musk comes to the potential rescue in this industry? Here's a fun AI generated image of what Elon might consider a TeraFab. We know the gigafactory was used for producing components needed for vehicles, for electric vehicles. Can you move that forward by a couple orders of magnitude, 1,000 times larger, go to giga to tera, and now make fabs and the cutting edge equipment that's required for the world's highest performance chips? Elon knows that chips are just as important as electrical vehicles for the world. He wants to be involved in the manufacturing of them. And certainly this is self-serving for Tesla, who uses a lot of its own chips that it has designed, but is also contracting others, including Taiwan Semiconductor, to manufacture. And so Elon has the idea of producing his own TeraFab. He, from his initial estimates, believes that it might make up to 20% of the world's high-performance chips capacity. 20% of a $1 trillion industry that is semiconductors today. This is absolutely massive in scale. And of course, it's very highly complex in all of the equipment that goes into those. The traditional semiconductor manufacturing supply chain today, if you look at the various earliest stages of the manufacturing process, it's based upon lithography. We talked a lot about ASML. We talked about extreme ultraviolet lithography and the process that goes through that. Then you've got etching and deposition. This is somewhere that a company like Applied Materials, which is a US-based company, is kind of in the middle of the process. And then you've got the packaging that's a little bit downstream of that. Packaging, a company like BE Semiconductor might be working on, how can you actually put the dies together? How can you actually package chips closer to one another and the final chips that are produced out there? And then, of course, ship them out to the companies that need them so they can compute as efficiently as possible. There's a lot going on in that. And one idea, which is being tossed around right now, I don't know how feasible this is going to be, but in addition to making a TeraFab, there's another idea of making a space-based data center. Wow, that sounds cool and terrifying at the same time, that there might actually be data centers that are crunching numbers and doing all the AI execution of the high-performance computing that are floating in low Earth orbit around our planet. Dear Lord, I do not want to be directly below one of those at any given time, but the idea, at least from a scientific and technical perspective, makes sense. You're at zero gravity, so you're not competing against the gravitational pull of Earth. You are at extremely low temperatures in outer space already, so you don't have to worry about all of the cooling that's required. And of course, the power can come directly from the sun. You don't have storms, you don't have clouds, so you're getting much more efficient power transfer to these things where power is a huge bottleneck right now. The question is, can you actually do something like this? Robert believes in his expertise that this is something that is definitely going to happen. Again, it sounds crazy right now. It sounds completely unfeasible. It sounds completely terrifying, but he was on the train that this is something that does just make enough sense for a large data center to be placed into outer space within the next decade or so. We don't have any idea what the timeline is going to look like. But these are not just science fiction ideas. They're not just academic discussions. This is an industry that, again, the semiconductor industry as a whole is $1 trillion here in 2026. We've got to find more efficient ways to manufacture these chips and do it in ways that are commercially available. And so I thought it was pretty neat, Heather, hearing Robert's discussion about where we're going with semiconductor manufacturing. It doesn't sound like Taiwan Semiconductor has got any shortage of demand and is going to be in business for quite a few more decades going forward, just because there's a huge thirst, an endless thirst for computing for these AI applications.
Yeah, that was one I would definitely rewatch over and over again. He's just such a font of information. The data centers in space, he just is like, yeah, of course, they make so much sense. And you're just like, okay. Yeah, I mean, what you're saying makes sense, but at the same time, does it? But yeah, I mean, there is the solar, there is the cooling. It's just the concept of it being in space and low orbit where there's already a lot of satellites and trying to figure that out. But who knows? I guess we'll be at a point in the next 10 years where that is quite possible. One of the really interesting things Robert talked about was looking at the chip manufacturers' ability to be getting more efficient chips, where they were getting more successful at making more and more processors on a single chip. Is that the right term? Yeah, without high rate of failure, because there's always a slight rate of failure. But he said to look at that rate of failure when you're looking at a chip manufacturer for investing. And so that is something worth checking when you are looking into investing in these companies, that because if you don't know anything about chip manufacturing, it's kind of just, yeah, it all seems great. But that was his number one factor to watch.
That is a great point, Heather. And specifically, I believe you're calling about optimizing the yields of
Thank
the
you. Yeah.
output or process, right? Because it's not just, oh, hey, guess what? We're going to make a newer and faster chip, and all of a sudden everything's going to be hunky dory and rosy. There's failures that happen along the way. Key customers actually reject bad lots if they're not up to standard. And the output of actually functional chips, especially when you're getting to 2 nanometers or below, transistors that are super, super tiny, going onto those chips is not automatically a guarantee that's going to work. Good point on the yields. Let's move on. That was a neat show. Again, talking a lot about Elon and TeraFabs and space-based data centers and the future of manufacturing. We went on to talk on February the 16th in a third show about why infrastructure is the real winner in the age of AI. And this is one that I talked with Bastion Fiduciary Portfolio Manager John Rotanti. John is, again, a portfolio manager for the industrials sector in the work that he's doing. John's a good friend of mine, and I always respect his opinions. But he kind of started the show by kind of calling out the SaaS apocalypse, Heather. To be fair and without pulling the punches, he said, look, software companies have got zero switching costs for a lot of these companies. They've got zero economic moats, and there's very low barriers of entry. Everyone just creates a software as a service platform, and they get everybody on them and they get all excited. And then all of a sudden, when times don't turn as well, people leave. The tech industry is going through kind of a downturn, laying off a lot of employees from those large tech companies, and the companies that really quickly spun up their businesses and got a whole bunch of people signed up for seats on their platform are now losing those subscription-based revenues and those seats from the users and their customers that they had. And so he was not surprised that there was kind of a correction for the SaaS industry because he thought it got too excited about itself in the first place. We loved the revenue growth. We loved how quickly things were growing and how good the margins looked for a little while there and the cash flows too. But he said, look, this is not a defensible industry that's going to have those sustainable competitive advantages that we're going to create decades of returns on invested capital that were very sustainable. I said, okay, John, well, you can't ignore everything that's going on in AI right now. What is your opportunity to play in this space? And he said, oh, Simon, it's got to be infrastructure. You look at the cost of a data center, which is now $40 billion on the low end, $100 billion on the high end, and maybe even higher than that as we kind of go larger and larger in the build-outs that we're seeing out there. And, of course, NVIDIA and AMD and the cutting edge chips are going to play a crucial role in those data centers. You're going to have the high performance computing right at the center of all this and the memory at the center of all this too. But there's also a whole lot more that goes into data centers than just that. We talked about the power requirements. We talked about the cooling requirements. We talked about the chillers, which are keeping a lot of those liquid cooling systems running for the data centers that are out there. Talked about the engineering and the construction and all the networking and all of these other things that go into a data center. And the companies that traditionally have served these markets, they've been around for decades, if not centuries. These are companies that are already well established, are already very, very efficient in their operations. They understand relationships with customers. They understand the service angles of anything that they install. And it's not so hard to displace them. And there's also not a whole lot of companies that are really trying to displace them out there right now. And so John says, hey, there's some great infrastructure providers who are getting just this gigantic hurricane-sized tailwind behind them right now. And it's making their businesses even more profitable. And so he mentioned Amphenol. APH was the ticker on that one. This is a company that was producing, the wiring and the cabling and the things that are going in and just connecting information and servers and things like that within a data center, networking cables, things like that. He talked about Train Technologies. TT was the ticker on that one. This is a company that is providing the air conditioning systems. You might have them in your home right now that are cooling down your home. You've got to keep air conditioning for data center rooms at least 70 degrees, if not cooler than that. We talked about the chillers and the cooling systems and stuff like that. A company like Vertiv Systems that's doing neat things for that. And the infrastructure is going to be such an important play in this AI build-out that we've got going on. And Heather, Jensen Huang from NVIDIA says that this is going to be a $3, if not a $4 trillion spend on data center infrastructure between now and the year 2030. Within 4 years, $4 trillion, by my math, that's at least $1 trillion on average per year that we're spending on data centers. You're going to have sold out components from all of these infrastructure providers because that's a lot more than they've been installing in previous years. So really interesting to see in this conversation how important the data center has been for a lot of these infrastructure providers. And we also looked at, a few specific names that might be really well capitalized to take advantage of this.
Yeah, I loved how John's discussion about SaaS was that they have no moat, but also like but with data centers right now and the build out, it almost doesn't matter if they have a moat because no one can keep up. And so it's like if you find good quality companies, they will have a moat going forward. But if you can find the suppliers right now, they have such a huge runway. Yeah. And so as long as you can find a good supplier, like you are set for the foreseeable future, because they need as many suppliers as possible making every single piece of a data center. You saw that graphic I put up of just endless supplies, and we don't have enough of any single part of this. And so if you can find various investments, you recommended Terrain Technologies not too long ago as the cooler. That's really where the picks and shovels are in AI right now. And I really enjoyed his discussion about, he is a value investor, and that is where the value is in AI right now.
Can we agree on that as growth style investors and as value style investors? This is an important sector for both of those. If you are a value investor or even a growth style investor, and you see a company like Micron, who has got the next 12 years of its high bandwidth memory completely sold out, or you've got a company like Terrain Technologies, like you just mentioned, that has now got a 12-month lead time on installing an HVAC system for a data center, or you've got a company like Schneider Electric, who's got an 18-month lead time for the transformers for the power conversion. How can you argue with that, right? Even if these stocks are selling at expensive valuations, the predictability and the visibility of those future revenues is so comforting to Wall Street that you almost don't want to get out of these stocks at this point. And it's just the pace of this gets higher and higher. These companies are adding capacity as quickly as they possibly can. That kind of appeals to the growth style investor and the value style investor at the same time. You get the comfort and the predictability, but you also get the growth. Really a neat sector to invest in is infrastructure.
It's such a funny crossover. When did the HVAC get exciting?
Who would have thought? Air conditioning systems,
But yeah, we all seem in on it. Everyone's agreeing. But yeah, that's definitely another one that I think was full of Easter eggs and worth a rewatch, because John is just a font of investment knowledge.
It was, and I thank you for mentioning.
Oh, you're sharing. Okay.
Thank you also for mentioning that we had looked recently at Terrain Technologies. Right, there's Terrain Technologies. There's the HVAC system right there. Hopefully, you can see. I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but I am circling, the HVAC system that we've got on our watch list right there. Schneider Electric, the power components right there, right next to it. It was back in October that we looked at on our own watch list of 7Investing. Our watch list is something that, in addition to having these conversations externally, we pull in new ideas to the scorecard and we say, what is really interesting that we have not invested in recently? You can kind of see some of the themes here in addition to the data center infrastructure. You've got the space economy back there in September. Back in August, we actually looked at Kava and Chipotle, the quick serve restaurants, and then some other neat things here too. I love the watch list. Every month we publish the watch list there on 7investing.com of two new ideas, and we kind of do a little bit of a mini deep dive to introduce them, and then it kind of brings them into the research universe as we dig even deeper into them. So that was a fun one. Infrastructure with John Rotanti. We then went on in February 18th. We talked with Nick Rossolillo, who with his wife Casey Rossolillo, runs Chipstock Investor. They talked with me about kind of this future of these cutting edge semiconductor chips. We talked about infrastructure. We talked about the data centers, and now we talked about, okay, what about NVIDIA and AMD? How is their roadmap progressing? What are the newest chips that they're developing, and are they still going to be as popular in the stock market as they have in years past? The clear answer was yes. The market for these cutting edge chips has been on fire, as you already know. In addition to Jensen, forecasting there was going to be $3 to $4 billion of infrastructure spend, which was going to directly include his own NVIDIA chips within that. His own cousin once removed, Lisa Su, who just so happens to be the CEO of AMD, his largest rival out there. Lisa thinks that the market itself for AI data center chips is going to be worth $1 trillion annually by the year 2030. So that's several times larger, about 4 times larger, 3.5 times larger than the total market is today within 4 years. So these market predictions are huge, but we also saw that AMD kind of stumbled out of the gate when it reported its most recent earnings. When you're Lisa and you go out there and you make this kind of announcement, there it is, $200 billion 2025, call it 300 to 350 billion dollars this year, up to $1 trillion by 2030. When you're saying that it's going to be 40% a year compound annual growth rate, AMD did not hit that target here when it reported its most recent quarterly results. And so we saw AMD's stock actually sell off a little bit on the announcement. Maybe we set the bar a little bit too high for AMD, or maybe we didn't. Maybe this is just this is something that doesn't go up in a straight line. We know that these deployments, tend to happen in step change, build outs. A large data center would cost $100 billion. That doesn't just go live in day one. We also know that there's a roadmap. We had NVIDIA that released its Blackwell chips, and then we had the Instinct, the MI series from AMD that just followed right after that. Then, now we've got new chips coming out from NVIDIA, new chips coming out from AMD. You've got new product releases every year that are going to be even more efficient than the previous ones. Now, if you need cutting edge computing today, you can't wait for next year's processor to come out. You've got to serve where the demand is, which is right now. But you also know that there's something even better and more efficient that's probably going to be coming out between 12 and 18 months into the future. So it's kind of an interesting trade-off between what does the quarterly results for AMD look like today versus what is the market going to look like 4 or 5 years from now. I thought that was a really interesting part of the conversation. We also talked about some newcomers, Heather, and if we could put up the graphic of Cerebras processors. They've got these wafer scale engines that are massive. Look at the size of that. This is very, very different than a silicon wafer, which tends to be circular. Cerebras is now trying to get every single millimeter it can out of the wafers that it's manufacturing and making them even more efficient, that larger, because they want them to be even more efficient in the processing, the memory exchange that's going on between them. And so a company like Cerebras is saying, hey, do you have something where efficiency is the highest in demand that you possibly have? Does every single percentage point of computing power efficiency matter to you in the data center that you're using for AI inference? If so, you've got to use our wafer scale engines. You've got to talk to Cerebras. This is a company that's going to go public, most likely here in 2026. They wanted to do it last year. They got a little bit of a second look from the regulators because of some of the things they were selling in the Middle East. That's near completion right now. They're preparing the paperwork, as I understand it, for 2026 IPO. Cerebras is definitely a hot company to keep an eye on. That and quantum computing, IonQ and all of the other publicly traded quantum computing companies now too. A lot of that is going to be working in tandem with the GPU accelerators that are already cutting edge from NVIDIA out there right now. So a fascinating conversation, again, with Nick, with Chipstock Investor. I appeared on his show directly after this. Just a lot of neat stuff going on, behind the scenes of the processing. You almost forget about this when you ask GPT a question, what's going on, or when you ask Alexa a question, there's a lot going on in milliseconds to get those responses to you as quickly as possible. The computing industry has got a lot of innovation going on. It was really neat to see what not only NVIDIA, but also AMD, and then also the newcomers we're working on at the status quo right now.
I will link your show with Chipstock Investor in the show notes if people want to check that out. The one thing I really enjoyed I enjoyed a lot of things from his show, but one other takeaway was how he was discussing how we always been talking about NVIDIA versus AMD, but how Broadcom is kind of a secret second place versus AMD with NVIDIA, because AMD is just constantly chasing NVIDIA when Broadcom's kind of been doing a little bit more of its own thing. It's doing a little bit less chasing notes, but it's been doing a little bit more application specific integrated circuits for hyperscalers. It's separated itself out enough, while AMD is just trying to do everything. And while they're doing really well, and especially when it's coming to CPUs where they're actually doing better than Intel, Broadcom is an interesting stock here that's best to not be forgotten, and
A
which no one forgets Broadcom ever.
fantastic point, Heather. Kind of, almost forgotten a lot of the times. Everyone's talking about NVIDIA and AMD, but those companies are making an 80% gross margin on the GPUs or the CPUs or something. If you're Google, do you want to pay all the money to NVIDIA for these cutting edge chips? Yeah, I mean, NVIDIA is really good at what they do, but maybe if you're large enough and you're spending tens of billions of dollars, you can design in-house a lot of that work that they're doing. And that's exactly what Google did. They created a tensor processing unit, the TPU, and they worked with Broadcom to develop it. And not only is Google selling those or using those, deploying those internally for its own data centers, but it's now selling those to other customers. Anthropic is now buying those same TPUs that Google designed with Broadcom. But again, that's an ASIC. That's a custom application specific, very, very narrow focus of computing that's doing extremely efficiently, especially the inference and training that's being done in data centers. So great point on Broadcom. Great point on everything that's going on outside of just NVIDIA and AMD, who want to sell as many of their own chips as possible, but people are designing their own as well. We went on then in the last show that I'll highlight here on this show, because we are coming up on the end of the show here for today. But on February 27th, just a couple of days ago, we talked with Eric Bleeker from 24/7 Wall Street. I love the name of the show you came up for this one, Heather. From fiber optics bust to AI optics boom. We talked in the first part of the show about how America spent almost $1 trillion on laying fiber optic cable, with one of the most massive infrastructure spends of the entire tech industry, just in laying all these cables for high-speed internet. It became the backbone of high-speed internet across America. We call that a bust because it cost a lot of money, and then it took really 2 decades to really recognize what you were going to do with all that CapEx. And yet right now, we're almost seeing the same thing for AI optics, not of the same magnitude as $1 trillion for fiber optic cable all across the country, but AI optics was being used as well. And the thing that Eric and I talked about was co-package optics. This is where you're actually integrating fiber optic transmitters and receivers directly onto the chip itself. Previously, you used to have a pluggable optic, which you would install into a module onto the side of the printed circuit board. You can see over there on the left during the 1990s. Now we're getting those directly put onto the chip itself. You've got a substrate to attach it, but it's right there next to your processor, right there next to your ASIC that you've designed. And of course, when you've got something that's doing the number crunching, the executing, the computing itself, you've got to send that information through the rest of the server, through the rest of the data center. And so not all of that has to go across copper interconnects, which are very inefficient compared to a lot of other materials. A lot of times you're actually using things called transceivers to transform that electrical signal that's being done in the processor itself into a light signal that is carried by a fiber optic cable to the rest of the chip and the rest of the data center. So you've got transceivers to actually produce that into light form, energy form, electrical information transformation into light, and then fiber optic carries that information to other parts of the data center where you need it. And then you've got a receiver that converts it back into electrical again. Really cool stuff, right? It's like turning your computer into lightning and then turning it back into a computer somewhere else where you need it. And so the idea of co-package optics is basically just improve the signal and improve the heat that's created from all of this transfer of information from electrical signals, minimize the degradation that's coming from that, and be more efficient in how you're transmitting information across a data center. I hope you've got a good cup of coffee for everything that we discussed about in that conversation. It was some of the most insight-dense conversation that we've had. Very, very technical, but fascinating, because this is a neat, smaller technology. This is not something that immediately the biggest companies went out there and developed themselves. There were smaller cap stocks and companies like Lumentum and companies like Applied Optoelectronics that were making the lasers and making the transceivers and the receivers that were actually going in very small quantities at first to companies that were super ahead of the curve. And now all of a sudden you've got much, much larger companies that are interested in the same technology. And so that's why you see a company like Lumentum stock, which has doubled within just the last 2 months, in the first 2 months of 2026. You see a company like Applied Optoelectronics, who, when we had this conversation there at the end of February, it was actually the earnings day for that company. It was up 40% due to better than expected demand. I mean, companies like this, when you got a really neat technology that all of a sudden hits the mainstream, but you're still a small stock, you can get super, super really good returns as an investor if you're willing to go fishing into the small cap pond. And so a lot, Heather, of what we talked about in that conversation was kind of, the technologies themselves, but then also are there a lot of stocks that are off the radar of other investors that we should be looking at a little bit more closely here?
Yeah, we used copper for so long because it was cheaper. Not that copper is, cheap, but it's just it gets so hot, it's not efficient. And he talked about a single AI cluster exchanged more information than was it just the entire east to west coast? Is that what he said? Just
From
looking
a
through my
couple of
notes.
years ago. Yeah, it was
It
insane.
was
Mind
just
blowing some of the stuff he was talking
a
about.
massive amount of information is having to pass through these. And so you have to use these fiber optics. And because it's been such a just kind of dead industry for a little while, they're just, as you said, there aren't companies like big companies doing it. And so it's these little under the radar companies. But you have these massive AI super giants who need them. Nvidia needs it, Broadcom needs it, uh, Marvell needs it. They're all just desperate, and they're just give us whatever you can. They'll pay whatever they'll pay whatever they need to pay to get, because this is another one of the huge bottlenecks for AI data centers. And so these companies are in such a good position because this isn't something you can just jump right into. I there's a decent moat. There's some technology here, as we saw with that chart of designing these. And so it's a really interesting space. And it is funny that it's just been around for, 20, 30 years. And all of a sudden we're all really excited about it again. After it's just kind of been quiet for 2 decades.
It's so neat, Heather. Do you know when you buy a loaf of bread, the small little plastic piece that holds the plastic in place so the bread doesn't get exposed? The small little, plastic thing that's holding in there. The guy who developed those apparently lives in Texas on the middle of a giant mansion on a hill right by the river. But it's because what is the cost of that for a grocery store? Minuscule, right? But the volume's just exploded. And you want to find something that's not breaking the bank of these companies, but it's making them much, much more efficient, right? This is a small cost for a company that's designing cutting edge chips to say, okay, yeah, let's offload some of that to go through fiber optics rather than, copper. It seems like it just makes sense. And if you're a small company, all of a sudden you get an explosion like that. It's a small piece of a much, much larger pie. No brainer. That's why you can see some of these shooting to the moon. Some of these stocks really, really doing well lately.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a neat one. That was the final one. That was the fifth one that I wanted to highlight here. Again, we had more shows than that, but those were the five that I think really kind of keyed in on semiconductors here in February. And I took all this. I put on my Sherpa hat. I climbed the mountain of enlightenment, and then I came back and I said, okay, out of all of this we talked about, what is most interesting here? Simon, if you're only investing in one company that's a semiconductor company, based on everything you just heard and everything you just learned and all the insights you just got, which one would you pick? So I did that. Heather, I did that. I made my recommendation. It's my official recommendation here in March. You can check it out at 7investing.com. You can see it for free at 7investing.com/subscribe. And you can see why I chose this one company, because in addition to all of these neat technologies that were rather niche for the most part, right? And we're talking about co-packaged optics, or we're talking about, cutting edge, kind of these neat technologies that kind of fit together into puzzle pieces. This is the company that's assembling the entire puzzle together. Like, this is the underappreciated winner of the AI age. Of all of this that's going on in the data center right now, who is going to capitalize the most on this? And their stock, by the way, has been selling off significantly here in the last month for reasons you don't need to be concerned about as an investor. It is due to a short-term hiccup in margins. This is a company that's going to win really, really big for a very, very long time. You've got a buying opportunity right now with the market distracted. So that's my pitch for my official March recommendation. Again, I don't want to just give it out there for free. I want you to come take a look at it at 7investing.com/subscribe. Again, free for your first 7 days, but see my number one play in the semiconductor industry, which is my official recommendation at 7Investing. So I encourage you to check that out. I really appreciate everybody who's followed along with all of our shows here in February. It was a fantastic month. I learned so much as an investor about what's going on there with the chip space. I think as we're building out the schedule here for March, I'm actually going to pull a bit of a 180. I'm going to start looking again at the healthcare industry in March. And I say 180 because we've seen so much momentum going to the data centers and AI and all the software stocks and all of the chip makers. There was so much growth and so much momentum in those. I feel like a lot of that has escaped the healthcare industry lately. But we've got a ton of innovation going on out there, right? Whether it's genomic sequencing, whether it's a lot of the CAR T and the CRISPR drugs that are being used, and then also the new innovation that's going on in healthcare. I want to take a little bit closer look at biotechnology and see how AI is now going to empower the development of drugs that are serving some of these orphan diseases and rare diseases out there. I think that's going to be a focus here in March. We're going to start building out the schedule, but it was something that caught my eye when I started talking with Manisha Samy a couple of weeks ago, that healthcare needs to be back on our radar as it's coming back into the favor again. So that's something to look forward to. Again, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 10 a.m. Eastern time. We really appreciate you tuning into our 7Investing live stream show. It's on me now to come up with an equally good show schedule for here in March, knowing that we just had a fantastic one that we just had in February. So appreciate you. You know, again, today is March the 2nd, Monday, the March the 2nd. I'll be again on Friday. We're going to take off on Wednesday. We'll be back on again on Friday with our first discussion of healthcare as we build out the schedule here for March. I hope you have a great couple of days. We'll see you again here on Friday, March the 6th. Have a great day.